Hey everyone, it's Selwen here, and today I'm here to talk about The Division 2 beta. Now, The Division 2 is obviously a direct sequel to the original Division game from Ubisoft, a multiplayer looter shooter game coming in March the 15th, but recently a so-called private beta was available. I was able to get myself a key and give it a shot. So to give a brief overview, as I said, it's a multiplayer only looter shooter game, so think Borderlands, the upcoming Anthem game, Warframe, although this one is set in a realistic-ish setting, specifically in Washington DC, where the world has gone to crap and you play as this agent that is now trying to rebuild this world amidst of all this chaos and enemy factions controlling parts of the city. The original title was much more about the collapse of society, but the theme here is more focused on the rebuilding part, and some of the game's mechanics and systems do reflect that. Now, I will reserve my full judgment whenever the game actually releases, so some of what I'm gonna talk about here you can take with a pinch of salt. Nevertheless, we can still talk about the game's core systems, how it plays, its problems, and see if it's gonna be worthy of your time. So let's talk about what the game does right. So positives, like the shooting. As this is a looter shooter, most of what you're gonna do is, well, shoot things. And here, I'm glad to say that yes, the shooting feels pretty great. I wouldn't say it's the best shooting mechanics of all time, but the weapons have a nice feel to them. Some could do with some more work, like the shotgun type weapons are good, but I think it needs more impact. But besides that, going from an assault rifle to a LMG or, well, shotgun, or even a single-shot rifle, all feel very different and have their own places in the game where they are the most useful, which is great, and you can change your loadout at any time if you so wish. Anthem. But most importantly, I think above that is the enemies. Are they a bullet sponge nightmare? Well, surprisingly, they weren't, as far as I could tell in this beta. Now, the said beta did allow us to test low-level characters and a pre-made max-leveled character, and I'll get to the in-game character in a minute, but as far as a low-level character goes, with all the missions I did, enemies didn't felt spongy at all. Regular enemies died relatively quickly, even when playing solo, and the ones that were considered elites or tougher, which goes by color, purple health enemies usually have a higher armor threshold, and yellow ones are elites or bosses, I believe, were definitely more spongier, but it never got to the point where I was bored from taking too long to die, and I think the reason for that is that the mob health, the enemy health, and sponginess is correspondent to what they were wearing visually. For an example, one of the yellow elite mobs were always these guys full on this really thick armor plating and a Gatling gun that you can actually wear down as you shoot him, as you chip away at its armor. So it made sense that he was spongy, and when the armor started to give in and you shot his actual body, he died super quickly. So the visual responsiveness to your shooting felt right. The problem sometimes with bullet spongy enemies in realistic games like these is that you have this guy in minimal armor or no armor whatsoever, and you are headshotting him, for an example, and yet it still takes ages to die. That can take you out of the experience of the game and just doesn't feel good. But here that didn't really happen, and in the end, looter shooter games are all about shooting things. So bullet spongy enemies are gonna happen, just as a puzzle game will have puzzles, but here they felt great most of the time, personally. Now, the endgame enemies of the mission they allowed us to test, which I believe was like a raid, they were definitely tougher and with bigger HP pools and more armor. Well, obviously, and I got to say, doing that solo was practically impossible. It was really tough. I mean, the lower level enemies basically just shoot you, throw a grenade every once in a while, and try to flank you sometimes. And about the grenades, I did notice that they can spam the grenades if you don't shoot back for a while, which was a bit weird. But these in-game ones were relentless, constantly using skill powers with exploding drones, grenades, robots, flanking you, so the difficulty was quite high, but also a bit odd, as they were able to constantly use those skill powers, specifically explosive drones. Again, odd and a bit annoying, to be honest. It feels like enemy weapons and attacks don't have cooldowns and reloads like the players, the Asians. Maybe that can be tweaked towards the release, because it can get to a point is a bit frustrating and unfair. And this, might I add, was on normal mode. There was still a hard mode to play on. Even in a group was still relatively tough to go through, but as spongy enemies go, yes, you could consider some of these a bit spongy, but even then I wasn't bothered too much because these enemies were, again, full on armor. So it made sense that they were a bit spongy and did not induce that weird feeling that you're just shooting this mindless and spongy enemy simply because it needs to be spongy. Not only that, enemies do have weak points, not just regular headshots, which makes you do a lot more damage. And as I mentioned, the beefy guy, but some enemies might have explosives on them that you can carefully aim to make them explode and damaging all targets around it, or other type of weak spots that you can exploit, which makes a spongy enemy more fun to fight against. This also adds some element play, like fire can sort of stun enemies as they burn away, or the poison biohazard like chemicals that they have on their pouches can stun them, and you, by the way, can also make yourself stunned by it and your camera goes all crazy, and not in a nice way. The cover mechanics are also alright. Playing on a mouse and keyboard, you can go on cover by pressing space, and you can change cover by holding it whilst you're looking where to go. You can also go around corners while in cover, although it didn't always trigger the animation. Some corners simply didn't allow for that smooth transition, weirdly. Now that said, the controls on the keyboard, not just the cover but in general, are okay in some areas, but atrocious on others. I'll go over as to why in a minute, but as cover goes, it's again alright. Could be smoother and more tighter, but that's with the mouse and keyboard. Gamepad does feel a little bit better. As a side note, the famous going in cover and door shut is still very much present here, and actually your gloves keep track of how many doors you shut, so nice to see Massive and Ubisoft embracing the meme there. Now, you might have noticed that I mentioned skill powers before, and yes, we do have these skills, abilities to use. 8 in total to unlock, but the beta only had 3 available. Small things like a turret that you can summon or well spawn, and or a small drone that heals you, or rather restores your armor values. Your HP does regenerate over time here, but armor is something you have to manage with this armor kits, which is actually a nice addition on top of passive health regen, so you actually care about your health in a way. Well, not health, but armor, so you have to manage that a little bit. But as skills go, I really like the turret and the drone, even though I felt their CD is a little bit too long to make them more prominent in the fights. And you can upgrade, change how they interact, so say a turret to be a sniper turret, but it allowed for something else to press besides just firing your weapon, and add some more tactics to the overall combat, planning where you want the turret to go, or where you want this exploding drone to go, or when to use your health drone. And combining these skills with your teammates, because the game is very much about group play, co-op play, can also be pretty fun. However, I will reserve my full judgment on those skills with a full game once we have access to all of them. These skills, along with something called perks, is where you're also going to progress your character further in a traditional kind of way. Skills require skill points to unlock, which you get as you level up, and the perks and upgrades to the set skills require these tech items, which you can get in a variety of ways, such as missions, exploration, and etc. The perks are mostly passive improvements to your character, so they are not extremely exciting, like upgrading inventory slots or grenade capacity. There were also weapon mods with it, like little modifications you can add to your weapons to improve them, but in general not something super unique or exciting, but it does give you an incentive to collect all this tech, the CHD tech items, so you can keep on improving your character. There's also specializations, which I think only unlock at max level. We could try them with that pre-made character, which was very nice of them to allow that, and they provide a weapon, a unique weapon to each spec, and other tools like special grenades. So we had a sharpshooter, for an example, which granted a special bonus weapon, this pretty badass sniper, the survivalist, which granted this crossbow with explosive arrows and incendiary grenades. Also mentions traps, but I played it and I didn't see any trap abilities, so I do not on that, we shall see in the main game, and the Demolitionist with a freaking grenade launcher. So I thought this was quite cool, yet more depth to your character, basically this special class that you will be able to unlock for even more fun while you shoot things. And that special weapon that you get is a really cool addition as well, and that puts you on total of 4 weapons that you can wield at the same time. And I imagine having one of each spec in your group to be pretty valuable and fun to mix and match their abilities. So in general, as combat goes, pretty much great. Some areas where it needs some improvement, but where it matters the most, as in the shooting, it's fun. Now the content available also seems plenty. More than we can say about, well, Anthem, but I had main missions to do, side missions. Now, these missions mostly were about go to this area and we go inside this building with usually a boss or a mini boss at the end. I'm not sure if all of them are going to be like that, but the missions I did all worked in that way, which is fine. Only problem I saw was that inside buildings it felt a little bit on rails, like this super linear path for you to follow and just defeat hordes of enemies basically until you reach the end. Now obviously the main story missions will, well, tell a story and is said to be quite long at 30 hours. I didn't really pay much attention to what was going on in the story, as we are just thrown in the world. But yeah, inside the building missions all followed a familiar pattern, even though they looked great. The indoor areas are amazingly detailed and look very different, but feel the same. Now, there are other types of missions to do. There was control points throughout the city to capture, which results in you going to an area, taking back from the enemy faction, then defend it for a while, and then it becomes yours. And in turn, it will allow for allies and NPCs to roam around the area, around the city, reward you with a supply room with plenty of loot, and change the world around you, basically, which is really cool, as you felt that your actions had an actual effect on the world. Then there was other small missions, typical of Ubisoft, like go to an area and turn off the radio, which starts this mini hard mode, stuff like that. It feels a bit like busy work. Yes, they have rewards like XP or maybe an item or some other thing, but still I couldn't help but feel there was a lot of busy work type missions, and they seemed procedural generated, like they kept popping up at random times, so it seems content in that sense in those smaller missions will be never ending, but I might be wrong on that. Again, we shall see in the main game. Now, the busy work, I think it depends on how you view content. I think a good example would be the newer Assassin's Creed game. Some people might argue it's too much content, and well, busy work. Others might say, well, it's content, which is great. So it can be subjective, and here on Division 2 there's that as well, but to a smaller scale, at least on the beta. You can also chase after those CHD tech items that I mentioned before that you can use to upgrade your perks and skills by exploring these little areas throughout the city, and they are pointed out to you on the map just like a regular mission. Then there's the settlement system in the game, which is these places that you can help take back, much like those control points in a way, which had tons of information, and I'm not gonna lie, I felt a bit overwhelmed at first, but I always feel overwhelmed when playing Ubisoft games as they just throw so much in your face. But from what I gathered, you will be able to unlock settlements, which are these safe areas of which you can unlock side missions for it, upgrading the said settlements in the process, which will give you rewards like gear, supplies, or resources, or even staff, as you can have staff like this crew back in your main base of operations, which funnily is the White House, and the staff will unlock things such as crafting or the skill vendor, for an example. Now duplicate this to all the zones of this really huge map, and you're gonna have quite a lot to do, from missions, upgrading settlements, managing all of that, control points, and more of those little missions. Again, it depends on how you value content, but it seems we can have a lot to do while just leveling up. But there are other aspects of the shooter-looter genre, and is, well, the loot part. And how does that fare? Well, pretty good as well. Like the shooting, I wouldn't say is mind-blowing. You aren't really showered with gear-based loot like in a Roman bathhouse, but seeing and looting a blue item or an epic item or even a green item dropping from enemies feels great. The same applies to quest rewards, the supply rooms, which actually do shower you with loot, or these caches that you can open after leveling up or doing content like conflicts or some other types of missions. I'll get there in a minute. There's also these little areas that you can find while just out and about in the city. Now, the city does look amazing. It's huge, yet it maintains a very high amount of detail, from a simple street to an alley or inside a building. And I just love how nature is blending in with the landscape and how desolate it can feel. The day and night cycle with the weather looks exceptionally great as well. And nights, especially rainy nights, were my favorite to experience, with the lighting effects, lighting up the streets in this really nice way. It just looked really amazing and immersive. Sunrises as well, albeit a bit blinding, with the sun reflecting all over the buildings and windows. But having no snow, it does feel like something is missing, and not actually a Division game, but nevertheless still pretty great atmosphere. But that said, the city does have this little hidden spots. Be going to a sewer or an alley, there are tons of nooks and crannies that you can and want to explore. Just a tip, please add a flashlight. We really need it. Thanks. Now, this loot can vary between weapons, regular gear, but most prominently crafting materials and supplies. Getting those materials, well, is not the most fun thing ever, even though if I see something I need to loot it because, well, that's me. But the way you use your crafting materials in general, is not only for crafting, but it seems to also to fulfill these projects that require a variety of items and activities done. Rewards included XP, blueprints for crafting. I couldn't really craft in the beta as a staff needed for it was bugged for me or simply was locked off. I was trying to get it, but I couldn't for some reason. So yeah, looting is good and satisfying. Most of what you do is gonna reward you with loot one way or another, but finding these little hidden spots in around the city was really cool. I wish there was more things to loot besides crafting materials and supplies, as that's what you're gonna get the most, but they have their use, like getting food and water, for an example, can serve as turn-ins at settlements or the control points for XP rewards and whatnot. Once again, you can argue busy work, but we go back to what you value as content. There's also collectibles, by the way, telling these little stories like the echoes or old recorders. So there's tons of things to pick up and gather while you are just exploring or looting things and finding all those nooks and crannies. And in turn, you learn more about the world. Gear is also surprisingly RPG in nature, from weapons to regular armor, which include tons of slots like backpacks, knee pads, etc., on top of actually having gear sets that you can mix and match, or even just apparel, which just changes how your character looks. But even the normal armor, like what I mentioned, the body armor, backpack, also change how your character looks. And then it contains a variety of stats attached to them. Again, very RPG in nature, so just equipping gear and weapons, finding them and figuring out what's best for you was not only easy and plenty, it was fun. Speaking of customization, isn't just equipment gear that is plenty, character customization also seems that it's going to be quite extensive. We could only select these randomized presets, but from that alone you can see how varied the character customization will be. Now, let's talk about the Dark Zone, and it's still here and it was open in a beta for testing. The Dark Zone is basically this contaminated area and a PvP area, well, rather a sandboxy area where you will also do missions for gear mainly. Your progression here is actually separated, so you gain Dark Zone levels instead of regular levels. There is supply drops around that spawn randomly, all of which will contain loot, but the loot is contaminated, meaning you have to extract it at these specific points in a helo. And while that happens, you will be attacked not only by NPCs but other agents, being other players that can attack you. Now, in the other parts of the city, if you're not in a group, it's practically a single player game, only on settlements, bases, safe houses, you can save people, but on the Dark Zone is a MMO-like area, and agents, though friendly, can go rogue, killing you and stealing your loot that you gathered in these yellow pouches. So this turns Dark Zone into a prime ground for PvP, very valuable for loot, but also quite risky, and really tense place to get into, and all of that makes it a really fun area. However, the first game had issues, and this one it seems there was already some bugs going on with the rogue mechanic, so let's hope that the Dark Zone is improved in that sense, because it's the most unique part about the Division, and I know a lot of people enjoy the game mainly for its Dark Zone activities. I mean, I don't blame them. It's a really fun area to play in, especially with friends, so I hope everything goes well on that in the main game. There are other forms of PvP, which was surprising to see. These instanced areas called conflicts that you can queue up. Final version will most likely have more modes, but currently we had team elimination to play, which was okay, 4 on 4, pretty self-explanatory, go in and kill people. Personally, not a huge fan of cover-based PvP shooters, especially since this mode was just about killing people. Like the Dark Zone, you still have that objective, you have all the tension and the risk going on, but here is just killing people, and shotguns just felt a bit OP. I mean, if you didn't have a shotgun and flanked a lot, which was the most successful tactic, might as well just give up. And that's just how I felt. The game does employ various scaling systems for PvP before conflicts or even the Dark Zone area. Your gear gets normalized. The world also seems to scale with you, but not 100% sure on that. I do know though that you get scaled with people of your group, with the world normalizing as well. Actually, no, the world does not normalize, because I remember going into the map and each zone actually had its own levels, but might scale at max level. But was really nice to see yet more content in the game, and again, this was just beta. And that basically cover the positives, obviously with some negatives attached to it. Nothing is perfect. So now, I forgot the biggest positive of all. There's dogs in the game. Yeah, like actual stray dogs that you see and they run around. Actually, there's a few wildlife around, like raccoons, deers. But please don't kill the dogs. You can kill them, just don't. You know what will happen, right? Just don't. Anyway, the negatives. Well, the controls. The basic controls are just awful. Awful, awful, awful. General fighting, yeah, it's good. Cover could be a bit smoother, but it works. But the menu navigation... Jesus. Who thought that double-clicking on menus was a good idea? So basically here, not only are the menus quite confusing with so many clicks to get where you want to, you actually need to double click your mouse to open certain stuff. The first hour of the game I was actually trying, desperately I might add, to open the settings to change my graphics, but I couldn't. Well, turns out I had to double click the settings, and this is the same throughout the rest of the game. Not only that, sometimes the mouse works in certain bits of the menu, of the interface. Sometimes it doesn't, and you have to use your keyboard, which itself can be frustrating with multiple keys having weird shared uses. Well, like for one, there's tons of hold the key to perform action, which I hate, but then the worst example I have to demonstrate how awful this key mapping is, at one point I wanted to accept this call from an agent, as the game allows for matchmaking while you're just in the city. You know, people might ask for backup and you can join them either to just roam around or do missions, so you can group up dynamically like that. So I wanted to answer a call to see how it worked, but the key was to hold W to accept the call, while on the map I had to hover the icon of the call with the little arrow thingy, while W also moved the map forward, meaning as I hold it, it moved away from the place I needed to be to hold the key. So it just counteracted with each other, which made it impossible to answer it, until eventually it worked for some reason, like the timing eventually got it right. The mod section of the weapons, again, dreadful. A mouse doesn't work and just makes it over confusing. I mean, the overall UI looks great, but practicality overlooks, in my opinion, especially the case here. Rest of the PC version, when it comes to graphical options, it seems solid, and this is not even the final game, but I did have some performance issues in the form of freezes and stutters. Performance was decent, I was actually surprised by it. I was expecting much worse, but those stutters were a bit annoying. After a long session, the game also ran into weird sound issues. Sound simply refused to play or was just all messed up. No clue what caused that. The same for graphics after long sessions. Textures started to take longer to actually render, which was really weird. And I had the game on the SSD. That said, the soundtrack, the background music was really freaking good. I was completely blown away by it. There was also some DC issues at the start of the beta as well, the dreaded Delta 03 error, but second day everything seemed to run smoothly, at least for me, and those issues most likely will be ironed out in the final game, especially those performance and technical ones. Other negative aspect is on animations and just moving through the city. Exploration is great, as we covered, and jumping obstacles is also oddly satisfying, but the running animations, the sprinting one, does feel a bit floaty at first. I did got used to it in time, but I couldn't help but feel like I was slightly floating in the air, like my character is moving faster than it's actually moving its legs. And the other thing is that the city is huge, and the beta was only one small district, and yes, there is fast travel between settlements, bases, and safe houses, but for the most part you have to run everywhere, which is fine. There are skirmishes that you can get yourself into, which can get a bit frustrating over time. You can run into sort of dynamic events, like the radio things that you have to turn off, or run into NPCs fighting an enemy faction, which turns into this mini mission, or just, find little places that you can explore and loot. So as we covered, the world does feel alive in that sense, but playing for just 5 hours straight, going through the same streets without any form of shortcuts, because a lot of the buildings you cannot go through, multiple times I was just feeling a bit annoyed and frustrated towards the end, like I have to run all the way over there again, especially when I died. So maybe the full game will have more fast travel spots or something to alleviate this issue. Isn't game breaking, just a bit tiresome. Personally, I would love a mount here. I know it wouldn't work and doesn't make any sense, but a mount or vehicle would make it a lot easier and actually fun to traverse this huge city. So overall, it does look like a nice improvement over the original title in almost every single way. Endgame content seems to be more rich as well, although we only got a small taste of it, but in general there is a lot to do. Yes, some might consider it too much busy work, and I won't deny that, but I also won't deny that there is a lot to do, at least it seems so. So shooting things is fun, looting is fun, exploration was fun even though it has its downsides. Just seems like a solid looter shooter game, not out of this world, but just a nice iteration over its predecessor. The biggest downside I think the game has right now is competition. The original Division was hyped like hell. This one not so much, at least that's what I've been noticing. Maybe it's just too much competition, maybe it's all the Apex hype going around. I don't know, I don't think that many people are talking about this game, and well, we'll see when it actually releases. Still a full month till then. Now, will it get repetitive? That's the biggest question with these looter shooter type games. Well, maybe, probably. In the end, that kind of ends up being its nature of a looter shooter. Repeat the same processes for better and more powerful loot, although here it seems measures are in place to prevent that from happening. But once again, full judgment when a game finally comes out. So yeah guys, that does it for me for today. As always, thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe and like if you want to see more videos like this, and I'll see you all again soon.